The sun had long dipped below the city skyline by the time Naomi Clarke stepped out of Wellington Co., her workplace for the past 3 months. The day had been long, filled with spreadsheets, endless emails, and back-to-back tasks that left her drained. But exhaustion never stopped her from following the routine she had come to cherish. Instead of heading straight home, she made a brief stop at a small corner store down the street. She moved quickly, picking up loaves of bread, bottles of juice, and granola bars, staples she had learned were most appreciated. After paying, she stepped outside, gripping the bags tightly as she crossed the street. Waiting on the sidewalk near the company entrance was a small group of familiar faces. Some sat on worn blankets while others leaned against the wall, their eyes lighting up at the sight of her. Naomi. Right on time, an elderly man with a scruffy gray beard greeted her with a warm smile. She crouched beside him, pulling out the food and handing it over. "Good evening, Walter. How's everyone doing tonight?" A few murmurs of gratitude filled the air as she distributed the items, her heart swelling with warmth. These brief moments, these small acts of kindness, made her feel connected to something greater than herself. But what Naomi didn't know was that someone had been watching. From the top floor of Wellington Co., behind a wall of floor-to-ceiling windows, Damien Wellington stood with his hands in his pockets, his sharp gaze fixed on the street below. As CEO, he was known for his calculated decisions and ruthless efficiency, always keeping his attention on numbers and profit margins rather than the personal lives of his employees. Yet for the past several days, he had noticed the same thing. Naomi leaving work, stopping at the store, and making her way across the street to that same group of people. It wasn't just once or twice. It was every evening, like clockwork. He frowned. Why? There were no cameras, no reporters, no social media posts boasting about her good deeds. She wasn't looking for attention or praise. Damien had built an empire by understanding people, by predicting their motives before they even realized them themselves. But this puzzled him. Shaking off his curiosity, he turned away from the window and returned to his desk. There were contracts to review and deals to finalize, and yet, for the first time in a long time, his mind was distracted by something, or rather, someone, outside the walls of his corporate empire. The next day passed in a blur of meetings and reports, but Naomi barely had time to think about anything beyond her workload. She was deep in concentration, sifting through a complicated financial statement when she felt a presence nearby. Looking up, her breath caught. Standing right in front of her desk was Damien Wellington himself. The CEO rarely ventured down to this department, and when he did, it was never without purpose. Naomi quickly straightened in her chair. "Miss Clarke," he addressed her, his voice measured. "Yes, sir?" she replied, forcing herself to sound composed. He studied her for a beat before asking, "How long have you been working here?" 3 months, she answered, trying to read his expression. He nodded slowly as if processing the information. "And do you like it?" The question threw her off guard. "Yes, I do," she answered truthfully. "It's demanding, but I'm learning a lot." Damien seemed to consider her response before giving a curt nod. "Good, keep it up." And with that, he turned and walked away, leaving Naomi blinking after him, confused. That evening, as she left work and made her usual stop at the store, she had no idea that her life was about to take an unexpected turn. Naomi followed her usual routine that evening, stopping by the small market to pick up snacks before making her way back across the street. The familiar faces of the homeless community greeted her with tired smiles, and she knelt down beside them, handing out food as they exchanged stories about their day. Just a few feet away, standing near his sleek black car, Damien Wellington watched in silence. He had left the office intending to head home, but something made him pause. There she was again, kneeling on the sidewalk, her face lit up with a warmth that was strikingly different from the professional, quiet employee he had seen in the office. There was no hesitation in her movements, no expectation of recognition. It wasn't a one-time gesture. She did this every day. Damien exhaled sharply, shaking off the unsettling feeling creeping into his chest. He had built his life on logic and calculated decisions. People acted in their own self-interest. Everyone had an angle. But what was hers? As he slipped into his car and drove away, he realized that for the first time in years, his mind wasn't preoccupied with numbers, deals, or acquisitions. Instead, it was stuck on a simple question. Why does she do this? The following days followed the same pattern. Naomi spent her hours immersed in spreadsheets and emails, working with the quiet diligence that had made her invaluable to the finance department. She never sought attention, never drew focus to herself. But every evening, without fail, she left the office and went straight to the group waiting outside. Damien noticed. At first, he had thought it was just an occasional act of kindness. But now, watching from his office window, he saw the pattern. It wasn't random, it was deliberate. A habit. A commitment. He frowned, arms crossed as he observed her from above. People don't do things like this unless they expect something in return. But Naomi never took pictures. Never asked for praise. Never even lingered long enough for someone to make a fuss. It didn't make sense. At the office, Naomi had earned a quiet reputation, efficient but slightly clumsy, especially when she was under pressure. That morning, she was finishing up a report when a sudden notification popped up on her screen. Last-minute meeting, CEO and finance department. She swallowed hard. She had no direct reason to be nervous, but Damien Wellington carried a presence that made every room feel heavier. He was direct, pragmatic, and famously intolerant of wasted time. Taking a deep breath, Naomi grabbed her notepad and headed to the 34th floor, where the executive meeting room was already filling up. As she stepped inside, she immediately felt the shift in atmosphere. Eyes turned to her for a moment before returning to the documents in front of them. And then there was Damien. He recognized her instantly, but instead of greeting her or showing even a flicker of interest, he simply gave her a small nod before calling the meeting to order. "Let's get straight to it," he said, his voice firm. "The latest financial reports show solid growth, but there are inefficiencies we need to eliminate." As the department heads presented their findings, Naomi focused on taking detailed notes, so absorbed in her task that she didn't even notice when Damien's gaze lingered on her for a brief moment before shifting away. The meeting wrapped up quickly, and as she stood up to leave with the others, a deep voice stopped her in her tracks. "Miss Clarke?" Her body tensed. Turning, she saw Damien leaning against the table, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. "Come with me," he said. Heart pounding, she simply nodded and followed him to his office. Once inside, he gestured for her to sit across from him while he settled behind his pristine desk. Naomi sat stiffly, unsure of what to expect. "You've been working here for a few months now," he said, his voice measured. "What do you think of the company so far?" She blinked, caught off guard by the unexpected question. I really like it," she answered honestly. "It's challenging, but I'm learning a lot." Damien studied her for a moment, as if weighing her words carefully. "And do you have any plans for the future?" Naomi hesitated. She hadn't expected a man like him to take interest in something so personal. "Well, She had no idea that this conversation was about to change everything. Naomi hesitated for a moment before answering. "I want to grow in finance, maybe secure a more stable position, and one day, if I get the chance, I'd like to pursue a postgraduate degree." Damien nodded slowly, as if filing away that information for later. Then abruptly he changed the subject. "Every evening after work I see you helping the homeless." Naomi's breath caught in her throat. "He's noticed? You see that?" she asked, blinking in surprise. "My office overlooks the entrance," Damien said matter-of-factly. "I watch you leave the building every night." Heat crept up Naomi's neck. He had been watching her all this time? "It's not a problem, is it?" she asked cautiously. "No," he said, shaking his head. "I just don't understand. You do this every day, you spend your own money, your time, and you never ask for anything in return." "Why?" Naomi relaxed slightly. He wasn't criticizing her, he was genuinely confused. She shrugged. "If I were in their position, I'd want someone to do the same for me, and even if it's just something small, it makes a difference." Damien sat back in his chair, silent for a long moment, watching her with an unreadable expression. Then he leaned forward, lacing his fingers together. "You do this every day?" "Yes." He let out a slow exhale, muttering something under his breath before finally nodding. "You're dismissed." Naomi blinked. "What?" "You can go back to work. She hesitated for a second, waiting for some sort of explanation. When none came, she quietly stood up and left the office. As she shut the door behind her, she paused in the hallway, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Why did he ask about that? Why now? That evening, Naomi followed her usual routine, stopping by the small market, picking up food, and handing it out to those waiting near the office building. Unbeknownst to her, Damien was still watching from his office. But this time, he wasn't just observing. He was trying to understand. Why would someone who wasn't wealthy, who worked hard just to make ends meet, choose to spend what little she had on strangers? It didn't make sense to him. And for the first time in a long time, Damien found himself irritated, not with her, but with himself. Why do I care? Days passed quickly, and before Naomi realized it, the end of the month had arrived. By now, her routine was well established, spending her workdays immersed in spreadsheets and reports, and every evening stopping by the market before crossing the street to share food with those in need. And Damien? He was still watching. She didn't know it, of course, but the CEO continued observing from his office above, still unsettled by the way she never sought recognition. She never took photos, never posted about it online, never mentioned it to anyone in the office. She just did it. And for some inexplicable reason, Damien couldn't stop wondering why. That Friday, something different happened. It was payday. Naomi woke up, checked her banking app, and felt a wave of relief. Her paycheck had arrived. It wasn't much, but it was enough to cover rent, pay off a few overdue bills, and stock up on groceries for the month. Or at least, that was the plan. But as the day wore on, a thought refused to leave her mind. Marvin, the elderly man who always greeted her with a smile, despite the fact that his coat was practically in shreds and his shoes barely held together. Miss Ellen, the frail woman who wrapped herself in a thin blanket at night, even when the temperature dropped. Paul, the young man who always talked about getting off the streets but never quite managed to find a job. She could do more. Before she even realized it, she had changed her usual route. Instead of heading straight to the market, she stopped by a discount clothing store. A new coat and shoes for Marvin. A thick blanket for Miss Ellen. A few essentials for Paul. Then, she went to the grocery store and filled a bag with enough food to make sure they'd all have a proper meal that night. By the time she stepped out onto the street, her wallet was considerably lighter, but her heart felt immeasurably fuller. Naomi's wallet was empty, but her heart felt fuller than ever. "This is too much," Marvin murmured, clutching the new coat with trembling hands, his eyes glistening with emotion. "I don't even know how to thank you," Miss Ellen whispered, hugging the thick blanket as if it were the most precious thing in the world. Paul, who always tried to put on a tough front, simply stared at his brand new sneakers before muttering, This is gonna help me get a job." Naomi smiled, warmth spreading through her chest. "You don't have to thank me. You would do the same for me." That night, laughter filled the air. For the first time in a long time, the small group seemed lighter, happier, and to Naomi, that was all that mattered. Until she glanced at the time and realized something important. She had no money to get home. Naomi blinked, trying to think of a solution, but there wasn't one. She had spent every last cent. There was no point in dwelling on it. "I'll just walk," she decided. How bad could it be? 30 minutes later, she had her answer. The streets were growing quieter, the night air turning colder, and her feet throbbed in her uncomfortable work shoes. She let out a sigh, pulling her thin coat tighter around herself. She still had a long way to go. Then, the hum of an engine broke the silence. A sleek black car pulled up beside her. Naomi frowned as the tinted window slowly rolled down. When she saw who was inside, her breath caught. Damien Calloway. He raised an eyebrow. "How far are you planning to walk?" Naomi opened her mouth, then hesitated. Of all people, why him? "Home," she finally answered, trying to sound casual. Damien glanced at the road ahead. "You live far?" "Yes." A brief silence stretched between them before he let out an exasperated sigh and reached for the lock. "Get in." Naomi hesitated. Accepting a ride from her CEO didn't seem like the best idea. But honestly, she was exhausted. Without another word, she climbed into the car. The warmth of the interior wrapped around her instantly, and she couldn't help but let out a quiet sigh of relief. For the first few minutes, Damien drove in silence. Then, without looking away from the road, he finally spoke. "Why were you walking home?" Naomi saw no point in lying. "I kind of spent all my money." His fingers tightened around the steering wheel. "You got paid today?" "Yes. And you already spent everything?" She nodded. "On what?" Naomi hesitated for half a second before simply replying, "Helping the homeless." The car fell into complete silence. Naomi turned her head slightly, watching as Damien processed what she had just said. "You spent your entire paycheck on strangers?" His voice was laced with disbelief. She let out a small, awkward laugh. "Well, when you put it that way, it sounds like a terrible financial decision." Damien blinked. "Because it is." Naomi crossed her arms and looked out the window. "Not to me." Damien didn't respond right away. She could tell he was thinking, turning her words over in his head, trying to make sense of them. A few beats passed before he finally exhaled and asked, "Do you at least have money for rent?" Naomi smiled to herself before answering, "No, but I'll figure it out." Damien let out a short, humorless laugh. "Unbelievable, you're really—" He trailed off. Naomi raised an eyebrow. "I'm really what?" Damien's grip on the steering wheel tightened slightly. He stared straight ahead and muttered, "Different." Naomi blinked. Was that a compliment? The rest of the drive was quiet, but it wasn't uncomfortable. When Damien finally pulled up in front of her apartment building, Naomi let out a relieved sigh. "Thanks for the ride, Mr. Calloway." He studied her for a moment before replying, "If you're going to keep spending your money like this, at least let me know. I'll cover your ride home." Naomi laughed, shaking her head. "I'll manage, I always do." She opened the car door and stepped out, but before heading inside, she turned back to him. And then she said something that made Damien sit in his car for several minutes after she was gone. "Good night, Mr. Calloway, and thank you for caring." Damien frowned, watching as she disappeared into the building. And then, it hit him. He actually cared. But why? Damien Calloway didn't like distractions. His life ran like a perfectly calibrated machine. Meetings, reports, negotiations, all planned down to the minute. There was no room for unexpected variables, no space for sentimentality. And yet, as he sat behind his desk that Monday morning, something was bothering him. It wasn't a business deal. It wasn't an oversight in a report. It was her. Naomi Clarke. No matter how much he tried to push the thought away, Friday night kept replaying in his mind. The way she'd been walking alone in the cold. The way she had hesitated before getting in his car. The way she had so casually admitted that she had spent her entire paycheck on helping strangers. Her entire paycheck. What kind of person did that? Naomi Clarke was reckless, financially irresponsible, and absurdly selfless in a way that defied logic. But above all, she was intriguing. And Damien hated things he couldn't understand. The office operated as usual, employees moving through their daily routines, conversations murmuring through the halls. Naomi arrived on time as always and immediately dove into her work, completely unaware that the CEO himself was watching her from time to time. She looked normal, like nothing had happened. Damien tapped his pen against his desk, irritated. "You can't just ignore this," he told himself. After an hour of staring at reports without absorbing a single number, he made a decision. He picked up the phone and pressed a button. "Send Naomi Clarke to my office, now." Naomi had been focused on organizing a financial report when the message arrived. Her stomach tensed. Damien Calloway wanted to see her? She took a deep breath, forcing herself to stay calm as she made her way to the executive floor. The CEO's assistant greeted her with a nod and motioned toward the office door. "You can go in. He's waiting." Naomi adjusted her blouse, squared her shoulders, and stepped inside. Damien was sitting behind his large, dark wooden desk, his expression unreadable. "Close the door," he said. She did. "You asked to see me, Mr. Calloway?" He studied her for a long moment, fingers interlaced on his desk, as if assessing a particularly difficult equation. Then, finally, he spoke. "I want to understand something." Naomi tilted her head. "All right, what is it?" His gaze sharpened. "Why do you do it?" She blinked. "Do what?" "Spend your money on people who will never give you anything in return." Realization dawned. "So this is what it's about. You really want to know?" she asked, crossing her arms. "I do." Naomi exhaled, choosing her words carefully. "I do it because I can," she said simply. "Because I see them every day and I know no one else cares. And because—" she hesitated, then continued, If I were in their place, I'd want someone to do the same for me. Damien leaned forward, his elbows resting on the desk. But you have no obligation to help them. No one is asking you to. Naomi's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. Since when do we need an obligation to do the right thing? Silence. His dark eyes locked onto hers, unreadable, intense. Naomi didn't look away. Finally, Damien sighed and leaned back in his chair, running a hand over his face like a man dealing with a puzzle that refused to be solved. You're unbelievable. She shrugged. I hear that a lot. He shook his head slightly, like he still couldn't quite believe what he was hearing. You do realize you can't keep living like this, right? Spending all your money, putting yourself in difficult situations? Naomi lifted a shoulder. I always figure it out. Damien exhaled heavily, rubbing his temples. All right, you can go back to work. She nodded and turned toward the door. But before she could reach for the handle, his voice stopped her. If you ever need money. She turned back to him, raising an eyebrow. I'll cover your transportation, he said. Naomi narrowed her eyes. Is this a joke? Damien's expression remained serious. No, I mean it. Naomi studied him for a long moment, then shook her head, a quiet laugh escaping her lips. Mr. Calloway, I appreciate the concern, but Naomi Clarke straightened her posture, meeting Damien Calloway's piercing gaze head-on. I can take care of myself, she said firmly. He tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. That's what I thought. But Friday night, you were walking home alone in the cold because you spent every last cent on strangers. Naomi opened her mouth to argue, then closed it. He had a point. Damien crossed his arms. Next time, at least accept a ride. She studied him for a moment before sighing. If there's a next time, I'll think about it. Then, without another word, she turned and walked out of his office. In the days that followed, Damien found himself paying more attention to Naomi, not because he wanted to, but because he couldn't seem to stop. It was involuntary. He wasn't used to being curious about people. In his world, everything followed a logical pattern. Actions were driven by motives, investments were made for returns. But Naomi Clarke made no sense. She never changed. She came in, worked diligently, made quiet jokes with colleagues, helped whenever someone needed it, and at the end of the day, she continued her routine with the homeless. And Damien kept watching. But for the first time in a long while, he didn't know why. He wasn't sure what to do with the strange pull of curiosity she ignited in him. That Friday, something unexpected happened. Naomi had just finished work and was preparing to leave when the sky opened up, releasing a torrential downpour. She stood at the entrance, watching as the streets turned into rivers, before letting out a small sigh. This is going to be a nightmare, she muttered under her breath. Still, she tightened her grip on her umbrella and stepped forward. Before she could reach the sidewalk, a sleek, black car pulled up beside her, the tinted window rolling down smoothly. Damien Calloway. Her eyes widened. Mr. Calloway? He raised an eyebrow. Are you really planning to walk in this storm? She blinked. I was considering it. He exhaled heavily and unlocked the car door. Get in. Naomi hesitated. Is this becoming a habit? Don't make it weird, Damien said dryly. Just get in. She chuckled, shaking her head, and, for the second time, accepted the ride. The drive was quiet at first, the only sound being the rhythmic patter of rain against the windows. But after a few minutes, Damien broke the silence. Have you ever thought about asking for a raise? Naomi frowned, turning to him in surprise. What? He kept his eyes on the road. Your salary clearly isn't enough. Have you ever asked for a raise? She let out a small, amused laugh. I think I'd have to work here for at least a year before even considering it. Damien shrugged. Maybe not. Naomi studied him. And what exactly does that mean? He gave a small, almost imperceptible smirk. It means you might be more valuable to the company than you realize. She blinked, thrown off by his words. Was that a compliment? Before she could respond, Damien pulled up in front of her building. Naomi hesitated before reaching for the door handle. Mr. Calloway, why are you doing this? He turned to face her. Doing what? This, she gestured vaguely. Giving me rides. Caring. Damien was silent for a long moment before finally saying, because for the first time, I really want to understand you. Naomi felt her heartbeat pick up, just slightly, just enough for her to notice. Then, before she could think too much about it, she opened the door and stepped out. Before heading inside, she turned back to him, a small, genuine smile on her lips. "Good night, Mr. Calloway, and thanks for the ride." For the first time in a long while, Damien felt something unexpected. He smiled. Damien Calloway was not a curious person. He didn't waste time trying to understand people. He analyzed them, calculated their motives, predicted their next moves. But Naomi Clarke continued to defy every expectation, and it frustrated him. Lately, he had noticed something even stranger. He was starting to notice her. Not just her absurd generosity or reckless spending habits, but her. The way she furrowed her brows in concentration when she worked. The way she made subtle jokes when she was comfortable. The way she helped her colleagues without expecting a single ounce of recognition. And the most irritating part? She had absolutely no idea of the impact she had. That Monday morning, as Damien sat in his office reviewing reports, something became undeniably clear. Naomi Clarke wasn't just a puzzle to solve, she was becoming a distraction, and Damien had never been distracted before. Damien Calloway wasn't a man who cared about small office interactions, but today he found himself listening. "Naomi, do you have a second?" It was Mark, one of the finance managers. "Of course, what's up?" Her voice was light as always. "I need help with a report. Can you review it for me?" There was a short pause. Then, Naomi replied, "I'm not sure I'm the best person for this, but I can try." Damien frowned. Why does she always doubt herself? He knew Naomi was good at her job. Better than most, actually. But for some reason, she didn't see it. And for reasons he didn't want to examine too closely, he hated that. At the end of the day, Damien watched from his office as Naomi left the building. As expected, she made her usual stop at the small market across the street. But something felt off. She wasn't smiling like she usually did. Inside the store, Naomi picked up a few items and placed them on the counter. The cashier, a man who clearly recognized her, greeted her with a small smile. "The usual?" Naomi hesitated. She looked at her wallet, then at the food. And for the first time in a long while, she realized she wouldn't be able to buy everything she wanted. She had rent to pay, bills, groceries for the week. Naomi never minded sacrificing her own comfort to help others. But at that moment, reality hit a little harder than usual. She forced a smile. "I'll take a little less today, but next week I'll make up for it." The cashier nodded, bagging her items without another word. Naomi left the store and crossed the street to where the homeless people waited. She still handed out food. She still smiled. But something was different. Because for the first time, she asked herself a question she never wanted to think about. What if one day I can't help them anymore? From the top floor of the Calloway Enterprises building, Damien noticed. He always noticed. At first glance, nothing had changed. She was still there, handing out food, still talking to them, still giving them her time. But he caught the difference. The way her shoulders tensed, the way her eyes lingered on the people she was helping, just a second longer than usual. Something was weighing on her, and Damien hated that he wanted to know why. Without thinking, he picked up his phone and pressed a button. "Tell Naomi Clarke to come to my office, now." Naomi sighed when she received the message. She was exhausted. What could Damien Calloway possibly want now? Still, she grabbed her badge and made her way to the 35th floor. When she entered his office, Damien was already standing, leaning against his desk, arms crossed. His sharp gaze studied her, unreadable. "Close the door," he said. Naomi raised an eyebrow, but obeyed. "Mr. Calloway, if this is about our last conversation, I already made it clear, I'm fine." "Are you?" She hesitated. Damien was good at reading people, and right now he was reading her like an open book. He took a step forward. "Today, you bought less than usual." Naomi froze. "You were watching me?" "I always watch." She blinked, struggling to process that. "Mr. Calloway, I know you think my habits are strange, but I don't." "Ask for a raise," he cut in. Naomi frowned. "What? You deserve a raise," Damien said. "Ask for one." She let out a dry laugh. "I don't think it's the right time." Damien narrowed his eyes. "Naomi, you work harder than half the employees in this company. You deserve better pay." "I've only been here a few months," she argued, "and you want to wait a whole year struggling before realizing you deserved more?" Naomi swallowed. She hated that he was making sense. Damien watched her for a moment before sighing. "You need to learn to value yourself." She looked away. "I do know my worth." He smirked slightly. almost challenging. "No, you don't." Naomi felt her heartbeat pick up slightly. "Why do you care?" she asked quietly. Damien was silent for a moment before answering. "Because I want to understand you." And for some reason, that was the most honest thing he had ever said. Damien Calloway wasn't used to being challenged. In his world, people obeyed, agreed, and followed orders without question. But Naomi Clarke was different. She didn't try to impress, she didn't seek approval, and yet, he couldn't ignore her, and that bothered him. "You're a very unusual CEO, Mr. Calloway," Naomi said, crossing her arms. Damien raised an eyebrow. "And you're the most stubborn employee I've ever met." She laughed, shaking her head. Something about the sound was dangerously pleasant. For the first time since meeting Naomi Clarke, Damien realized he didn't just want to understand her. He wanted to see what would happen if he kept caring. In the days that followed, something shifted. Naomi was still the same, dedicated, hardworking, and relentlessly kind. She still spent her evenings helping the homeless, still handled her work efficiently. But now, Damien wasn't just watching. He was involved. He called her into his office more often, tested her knowledge, pushed her with harder assignments. And with each passing day, he became more certain of one thing. Naomi Clarke was unlike anyone he had ever met. And that both unsettled and fascinated him. For Damien, everything was a game of strategy. That was how he built an empire. He was always surrounded by ambitious, calculating people who only looked out for themselves. But Naomi? She wasn't playing that game. She had no angle, no hidden motives. She just was. And he hated how much he respected that. Then on Tuesday morning, Damien made a decision. He walked into his office and called one of his directors. "Prepare a report on last quarter's operating costs. I want it delivered by the end of the week." The director nodded. Understood. But before he could leave, Damien added, "And put Naomi Clarke on the team." The man blinked in confusion. "Naomi Clarke, the junior assistant?" "Yes." A pause. "Sir, she's new. Are you sure she can handle it?" Damien leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "I want to see what she's capable of." Naomi was in the middle of compiling a report when an unexpected email popped up. Project assignment. Last quarter's operating costs. Her name was on the team list. Her brows furrowed. That had to be a mistake. Before she could process it, a direct message from Damien appeared on her screen. "Come to my office." Now, Naomi exhaled slowly, grabbed her notepad, and made her way to the 35th floor. When she entered, Damien was standing beside his desk, a coffee cup in hand. He looked up as she stepped inside. "Close the door." She obeyed, trying to stay calm. "Mr. Calloway, this email, was it a mistake?" He raised an eyebrow. "What mistake?" "My name is on a major project." He nodded. "Yes." She frowned. "But I'm just an assistant." Damien smirked. "Not anymore." Her arms crossed instinctively. "Usually only senior employees handle projects like this." "Well," he said, sipping his coffee, "now you have experience." She blinked. "That's how it works?" "That's how I do things." Suspicion flickered in her gaze. "Is this a test?" Damien gave a slow, knowing smile. "What if it is?" Naomi studied him, searching for the catch. "Why?" His expression turned serious. "Because I think you're better than you believe." She stilled. "I want to see if I know what to say." Because for the first time in her life, someone believed in her before she believed in herself. And that was new. The week passed in a blur. The project was harder than Naomi had expected. She spent late nights reviewing financial statements, cross-checking numbers, and preparing for the final presentation. There were moments of frustration, moments where she thought she was in over her head. But every time she hesitated, she remembered Damien's words. "I think you're better than you believe." And for the first time, she wanted to prove him right. Numbers, spreadsheets, financial reports. Naomi Clarke had never imagined she would enjoy this kind of challenge. But as she combed through the details of the company's operational costs, she realized something. She liked it. For the first time in her career, she wasn't just working, she was learning. It was late Thursday night when an unexpected email popped up. "Subject: report ready?" Naomi exhaled, stretching her sore shoulders before typing back. "Almost. Just finishing the final adjustments." Seconds later, another email arrived. "Meet me in my office now." Naomi stared at the screen. Of course, Logan Calloway had zero patience. Swallowing down her nerves, she grabbed her laptop and headed to the 35th floor. When she walked in, Logan was seated behind his desk, scanning a document with his usual intense focus. He glanced up, then motioned toward the chair in front of him. "Sit." She obeyed, gripping the armrest slightly. Logan picked up her report and flipped through the pages. The silence stretched between them, heavy with anticipation. Then finally he spoke. "It's better than I expected." Naomi blinked. "Wait, was that?" Her eyebrows lifted. "Was that a compliment?" A corner of Logan's mouth twitched. "You decide." She rolled her eyes but smiled. He set the report down. "The presentation is tomorrow. Are you ready?" Naomi hesitated for half a second before nodding. "Yes." Logan studied her closely. Then he did something that completely threw her off guard. "Good job, Clarke." She froze. He had never once praised her before. Coming from Logan Calloway, those words meant something. She exhaled slowly, then smiled. "Thank you, Mr. Calloway." He nodded. And for the first time since meeting her, Logan realized something dangerous. He wanted to see her succeed. Not just because she worked for him, but because he cared. And that was a problem. The boardroom was filled with executives, their expressions unreadable. Naomi stood at the front, her heart pounding but her hands steady. Logan entered, taking his seat at the head of the table. He met her gaze and gave her a single nod. She took a breath and began. She spoke about operational costs, outlined solutions, and presented detailed charts. She kept her voice clear, her confidence growing with every word, and for the first time, she felt like she belonged there. When she finished, silence filled the room. Then suddenly, applause. One board member started clapping, then another. Naomi's breath caught in her throat. They were impressed. She turned slightly, catching Logan's expression. Something different flickered in his gaze. "Well done, Clarke." Warmth spread through her chest, because for the first time, she truly believed it. She could be more than she had ever imagined. Logan Calloway had been right about her, and now she finally saw it too. Naomi arrived at her desk, ready to dive back into work. But something unexpected caught her eye. An envelope. Her name was written on the front. She frowned, opening it. Inside was a short, direct note. "Good job on the presentation. Consider this an encouragement." LC Naomi raised an eyebrow. Inside the envelope was a bonus. A considerable bonus. She held her breath. Is this serious? Before she could even process it, she sensed someone standing beside her. "Good morning, Clarke." She turned sharply. Logan stood there, hands in his pockets, his expression neutral. Her heart definitely skipped a beat. "Mr. Calloway, this is a bonus." He nodded once. "Yes." She blinked. "Why?" "Because you deserve it." Her stomach flipped. Logan Calloway wasn't the kind of boss who handed out compliments lightly. If he was saying this, it was because he meant it, and for some reason, that mattered more than it should. Naomi swallowed. "Thank you." Logan nodded and walked away, and she stood there, gripping the envelope, trying to process everything. Something had shifted. Logan Calloway wasn't acting like himself. It wasn't just the meetings, the unexpected bonus, or the way he kept pulling Naomi Clarke into executive discussions as if her opinion mattered. It was the way he looked at her. Not in an obvious way. But Naomi could feel it. And sometimes, when she let her guard down, she realized she was watching him too. That evening, Naomi followed her usual routine. Leave work, head to the small grocery store, pick up supplies. But this time, as she stepped onto the sidewalk, something caught her attention. A sleek black car parked across the street. The window rolled down slowly. "Logan," she raised an eyebrow. "Are you seriously waiting for me outside work now?" Logan smirked. "You're really going to keep doing this, even after the bonus?" She laughed. "Of course." He studied her for a moment before pushing the car door open. "Get in." Naomi blinked. "Excuse me?" "Get in the car." His voice was calm but firm. "I want to see this for myself." She frowned. "See what?" "What you do every night." Naomi hesitated, but something inside her told her to go. So for the first time ever, Logan Calloway went with her. The moment they arrived, Naomi bit her lip to keep from laughing. The homeless community stared at Logan like he had just landed from another planet. And to be fair, he looked completely out of place. Marvin, the oldest of the group, eyed Logan suspiciously. "You're her boss?" Logan crossed his arms. "Yes." Marvin looked him up and down, then snorted. "Huh. Never thought I'd see a suit around here." Logan's expression remained unreadable. Surprise? Naomi had to turn away to hide her grin. But as she handed out food, she noticed something interesting. Logan was watching everything. He saw the way people smiled when they received their meals, saw their gratitude, their exhaustion, their resilience. He saw the real impact of what Naomi did every night. And for the first time, he had no idea what to say. As they finished, Naomi turned to him. "Well," she asked, "what did you think?" Logan was quiet for a moment. Then, finally, "It's different seeing it up close." She smiled. "Helping people feels good. You should try it more often." He raised an eyebrow. "Don't get used to it." She laughed, but deep down she had a feeling Logan Calloway had just changed, and maybe he didn't even realize it yet. The following days felt different. Their conversations had shifted. Their interactions lingered a little longer. There was something there, something unspoken, something neither of them wanted to name. But not everyone was happy about it. The day started like any other. Naomi was reviewing financial reports when a notification popped up. "Urgent email from Finance Director. I need to speak with you. Conference room 3. Now." Her stomach tightened. That was strange. Still, she grabbed her notebook and headed toward the meeting room. When she entered, her unease deepened. The finance director sat at the head of the table, along with the department manager and 2 senior supervisors. And in the center of the table, a thick pile of printed documents. The tension in the air was palpable. "Take a seat, Clarke," the director said. Naomi sat. "What's going on?" she asked. The department manager folded his hands together. "We need to have a serious conversation." Her pulse quickened. Something wasn't right. Not at all. Naomi Clarke had always been careful with her work, precise, detail-oriented. Yet here she was, staring at a stack of documents, being accused of manipulating financial data. She barely heard the finance director's voice as he gestured toward the reports. "These are the documents you submitted last week?" She swallowed hard. "Yes, those are mine." But then he tossed another set in front of her. "And these are the same reports reviewed by the audit team. There are discrepancies, serious ones." Naomi frowned. "Excuse me, what?" The department manager leaned forward, arms crossed. "You're being accused of falsifying financial records." For a moment, the world tilted beneath her. "What?" she breathed. But as she flipped through the papers, a cold realization hit her. These weren't her numbers. They had been altered. "This is a mistake," Naomi said, her voice firm. "I didn't change anything. These reports have been tampered with." The finance director remained unmoved. "Are you sure?" She clenched her fists. "I would never manipulate financial data." The department manager exhaled heavily. "Regardless, the board has decided to suspend you until this is resolved." Suspended. The word slammed into her like a physical blow. "It's standard procedure," the director continued. "While we investigate, you'll be placed on leave without access to company systems." Naomi stared at them in disbelief. This couldn't be happening. Hours later, she was walking out of the building with a box of her belongings. She could feel the stares, the hushed whispers, the way some colleagues quickly looked away as she passed. She swallowed against the tightness in her chest. And then, "Naomi?" She turned. Logan Calloway was striding toward her, his steps quick, his expression unreadable. Her heart clenched. "So, you've heard," she murmured. He stopped in front of her, his sharp gaze locking onto hers. "What the hell is going on?" She let out a shaky breath. "They're accusing me of manipulating financial data." His jaw tightened. "That's ridiculous." "I know," she said, frustration creeping into her voice, "but I have no way to prove I didn't do anything wrong." There was a long silence. Then Logan crossed his arms. "Who reviewed your reports?" She exhaled. "The finance manager and one of the senior supervisors." His eyes narrowed, his mind already working. "I believe you." Naomi blinked. "You what?" "I believe you," he repeated, voice steady. She didn't realize how much she needed to hear those words until now. Logan took a slow breath, as if reining in his frustration. "Give me some time," he said. "I'll fix this." Naomi shook her head. "Logan, you can't just step in. This could hurt you." His eyes met hers. Steady. Certain. "Do you really think I care about that?" She didn't have an answer. Then, taking a step closer, he lowered his voice. "Don't go too far. This isn't over." And for the first time since this nightmare began, Naomi believed him. For 2 days she stayed home, restless, anxious. She had no idea what to do, no way to clear her name. Until Wednesday afternoon, when she received a text from an unknown number. "Emily, I found something. Be at the office tomorrow morning." Elsie, her heart pounded. What had Logan discovered? The next morning, Naomi walked into the office. People stared, whispered. She ignored them. She only had one goal, Logan. When she entered his office, her breath caught. Logan was already there. But he wasn't alone. The finance manager and one of the senior supervisors sat at the table, and they looked uncomfortable. Logan, meanwhile, was perfectly composed. He turned to Naomi and nodded toward the chair across from him. "Take a seat." She did. Then Logan crossed his arms and looked directly at the finance manager. "Why don't you tell her what you just told me?" For the past week, Naomi Clarke had been fighting for her name, her reputation, her career. And now, sitting in Logan Calloway's office, she watched as the finance manager and senior supervisor squirmed under his cold, piercing stare. "We just found out," the manager said, his voice shaky. "There was an error in the report review." Naomi arched an eyebrow. "An error?" The supervisor cleared his throat. "Yes, there was a file mix-up, and it ended up looking like you altered the data, but in reality, it was an internal mistake." Naomi felt a strange mix of relief and anger boiling inside her. "So let me get this straight," she said, voice steady but sharp. "You suspended me, humiliated me, damaged my reputation, without even verifying the facts?" The supervisor avoided her gaze, clearly ashamed. "It was a rushed decision. Before Naomi could respond, Logan's hand slammed against the table, the sharp sound echoing through the office. Both men jumped. "A rushed decision?" His voice was dangerously calm. "You nearly destroyed the career of one of my most competent employees because of incompetence?" The men shrank back in their chairs. "This won't be ignored," Logan continued, his tone icy. "I want a formal apology sent to Naomi, and a full report on what happened." The manager nodded quickly. "Of course, Mr. Calloway." Logan turned to Naomi. "You can return to work immediately." She held her breath. "Really?" He smirked. "Really? And honestly, I'm surprised you even want to stay after this mess." Naomi exhaled, shaking her head slightly. "I'm not the type to give up easily." Logan's lips twitched into a smile. "I've noticed." As Naomi stepped out of the office, a weight lifted off her chest. She was back. But more importantly, she wasn't alone. Because if Logan hadn't stepped in, she would probably still be fighting to prove something she didn't do. And that meant she owed him. Naomi hated owing people, especially the CEO of the company. But there was something about the fact that he had cared, something about the way he had fought for her, that made her feel an unfamiliar, unsettling warmth inside. In the days that followed, the office atmosphere felt different. People looked at her with curiosity, some even with respect. After all, not everyone walked away unscathed from a situation like that. But what stood out the most was Logan. He wasn't obviously different, but Naomi noticed it. He stopped by her desk more often, asked for her input more, looked at her in a way that made her heart beat a little too fast. And then, something completely unexpected happened. On Friday afternoon, Naomi was buried in emails when her phone buzzed. A direct message from Logan Calloway. "Dinner tonight. You're coming." She blinked. "What?" She stared at the screen, making sure she had read it correctly. Was he inviting her to dinner? Or was this an order? Biting her lip, she typed back, "Is this an invitation or a summons?" His reply came seconds later. "A summons." Naomi rolled her eyes but chuckled. "And what's the occasion?" "Let's call it a celebration, for getting you out of that sabotage mess." She sighed dramatically. "So in reality, this is just a trap to remind me that I owe you." "Exactly. See you at 8 p.m. I'll send you the address." Naomi exhaled, shaking her head. This is a terrible idea. But for some reason, she already knew she was going to say yes. That night, Naomi arrived at the restaurant a little early. The place was upscale, dim lighting, elegantly set tables, definitely out of her comfort zone. The hostess led her to a private table, where Logan was already seated, waiting. As she approached, he looked up and gave a small smile. "Punctual," he said. "I like that." Naomi raised an eyebrow as she took her seat. "This place is way too fancy for someone who thinks a granola bar qualifies as a decent dinner." Logan chuckled. "I wanted to impress." She picked up the menu, pretending to study it. "You want to impress me?" He lifted his wine glass, watching her over the rim. "Apparently, yes." Naomi Clarke felt a warmth creep up her neck as she set down the menu. "All right," she said, crossing her arms. "What's the real reason for this dinner?" Logan Calloway leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "I wanted to see how you were doing after everything that happened." Naomi frowned slightly. I'm fine. He raised an eyebrow. Are you? She hesitated before sighing. Okay, it was awful. Logan nodded, satisfied with her honesty. And now? How do you feel? She thought for a moment before answering. I guess I'm stronger than I thought. A small smile tugged at the corner of his lips. Yes, you are. Naomi held his gaze, and that's when she realized this wasn't just a casual dinner. The air felt heavier, charged with something unspoken, something she wasn't sure she was ready to acknowledge. The conversation flowed more easily after that. Naomi noticed that when Logan relaxed, he wasn't nearly as intimidating as he was at the office. In fact, he had a dry, sarcastic sense of humor that genuinely amused her. And Logan? He realized that Naomi was even more intriguing outside of work. Sharp, witty, and completely unaware of the way she held his attention. After an hour of conversation, the waiter arrived with the check. Naomi reached for her wallet, but Logan shot her a look. You're not actually thinking of paying, are you? She raised an eyebrow. I can't even split it? No. That's a little old-fashioned, don't you think? Logan smirked. Call it traditional. She rolled her eyes but smiled. As they walked out of the restaurant, the air between them felt different. There was weight to it now, something neither of them had put into words, but both of them felt. And for the first time, Naomi realized she might be playing with fire. Until tonight, she had never really stopped to think about what it meant to have Logan Calloway's full attention. But now, it was impossible not to notice. He opened the car door for her, and just before she got in, he said something that made her heart race. I enjoyed tonight. Naomi swallowed hard. It was just dinner, she said, voice carefully even. Don't get used to it. Logan smirked. Too late. She got into the car before she could process what that really meant. But one thing was certain. Nothing would ever be the same again. By Monday morning, Naomi expected everything to go back to normal. But to her frustration, nothing was normal. Something had changed. And the most annoying part? She knew the reason was Logan. He wasn't acting differently. Not exactly, but she felt it. In the way he looked at her. In the way others looked at her after their dinner. And most of all, in the way her own heart reacted every time he was near. Which was a huge problem, because Logan Calloway was not someone to play around with. That morning, Naomi was focused on a report when she heard someone clear their throat beside her. She looked up. Logan, standing there, hands in his pockets, expression neutral. Would you accompany the CEO to the cafe? Naomi blinked. Was that an invitation? It was a summons. She rolled her eyes but smiled, standing up. They walked to the company cafe together, and Naomi felt the stares. People were watching them. People were paying attention. But Logan, he didn't seem to care in the slightest. When they reached the counter, he placed their order, without even asking her preference. Black coffee, no sugar. Naomi crossed her arms. You think you know me well, don't you? Logan smirked. I think so. She tried not to focus on the fact that maybe he actually did. When they got their coffees, Logan led her to a table in a quieter corner. For a moment, he stayed silent. Then he spoke. Naomi, he said, I want you to start joining more executive meetings. Meetings. Naomi nearly choked on her coffee. Wait, what? Logan leaned forward, his expression unreadable. You have potential. I want to see how far you can go. Naomi blinked, still trying to process. And what if I don't want to? Then give me a good reason. She bit her lip, hesitating. The truth, she did want to, but the fear of messing up was holding her back. Logan must have noticed because his gaze softened, just slightly. You're afraid of failing. Naomi inhaled deeply. I don't like making mistakes. Logan rested his arms on the table, meeting her eyes with a quiet intensity, then learned to fail without fear. She had no words, but deep down, she knew he was right. And maybe it was time to take the challenge. In the following days, Naomi realized Logan wasn't just making conversation. He was serious about this. She started getting invited to high-level meetings. Logan asked for her input more often. And slowly, the way people in the company looked at her began to change. She wasn't just an assistant anymore. She was someone Logan Calloway valued. And that didn't go unnoticed. By Friday, Naomi was deep in organizing a report when a notification popped up on her screen. A message from Logan. Dinner tonight. She raised an eyebrow. This time he was actually asking. The problem? Naomi knew that if she said yes, she'd be crossing an invisible line. She typed a response. Can't tonight. His reply came in seconds. Understood. But one day, you'll say yes. Naomi let out a slow sigh, because deep down, she knew he was right. The real question was, what would happen when that day finally came? She thought that turning down Logan's dinner invitation would clear up whatever tension was lingering between them. She was very wrong. In fact, it only seemed to make his interest grow. And the worst part? Her own interest was growing too. Days passed. Naomi's new routine now included more meetings, more challenges, and, most dangerously, more interactions with Logan. She loved everything she was learning, but she hated the fact that she and Logan seemed to be playing a game. A dangerous one. One no one dared to mention, but one they both felt. By Wednesday afternoon, Naomi was at the company cafe, waiting for her coffee when she sensed someone step beside her. She didn't need to look to know who it was. "Black coffee, no sugar," Logan murmured. Naomi smirked. "If I ever change my order, will you lose your mind?" Logan raised an eyebrow. "No, but I'd be disappointed." She laughed. They took their coffees and sat at a quiet table. For a moment, it felt like they were just two normal people. But then Logan spoke. "Why did you turn down dinner that night?" Naomi wasn't expecting that question. She blinked a few times before answering because it would be a terrible idea. Logan tilted his head slightly, studying her. "And why is that?" She crossed her arms. "Because you're my boss." He gave a slight smile. "That's never been a problem before." Naomi felt her face heat up. "Don't make this weird." "I'm not the one making it weird." She let out a slow breath. "Logan, we both know this can't happen." He was silent for a moment before replying. "And what if I wanted it to?" Her heart raced. He wasn't being subtle anymore, but she wouldn't cross that line. So she took a deep breath, gave him a small smile, and said, "Then that would be your problem." And with that, she stood up and walked away, before he could say anything else. That night, Naomi barely slept. Because she knew Logan wasn't the type to give up easily. And for the first time, she wondered if she wanted to give up on this. The problem? She already knew the answer. But admitting it? That was another story. In the days that followed, things felt different. Logan didn't back off, but he also didn't push. He was just there, watching her, waiting. And Naomi knew, at some point, she'd have to make a choice. At some point, she would give in. The only question was when. For the last few days, Naomi had been pretending. Pretending that Logan's gaze didn't make her pulse quicken. Pretending that she didn't notice how he hadn't asked her again about dinner. And pretending that his silence on the matter didn't leave her feeling disappointed. But the truth was undeniable. The tension between them was reaching a breaking point. And Naomi knew that sooner or later, something had to give. On Friday morning, Naomi sat at her desk, attempting to focus on the report Logan had requested. Or at least, she tried to focus. Every 5 minutes, her mind drifted back to him, to the way he looked at her, to the way he seemed to be waiting for her to make the next move. And the worst part? She wasn't sure if she even wanted to keep resisting. Letting out a frustrated sigh, she shook her head and forced herself to focus on the numbers in front of her. But then, her phone buzzed with a message. It was from Logan. "My office, now." Naomi rolled her eyes, but her heart stuttered in response. Grabbing her notebook, she stood, trying to appear casual, but deep down, she knew nothing about this conversation was going to be normal. When Naomi entered Logan's office, she immediately sensed that something was different. He wasn't sitting behind his desk like usual. Instead, he stood by the window, staring out at the city skyline, hands tucked in his pockets. She closed the door softly. "Do you need something, Mr. Calloway?" she asked, keeping her tone professional. Logan turned to face her. His gaze was steady, unwavering. And then, without hesitation, he asked, "How long do you plan on pretending you don't feel what I feel?" Naomi's breath caught. Her heart stopped for a second. She hadn't expected him to be so direct. Swallowing hard, she crossed her arms. "And what exactly do you think I feel?" Logan gave a small knowing smile. "I think," he said slowly, "that you feel the same way I do." Naomi looked away, trying to control the surge of emotions rising inside her. "This can't happen, Logan." He took a step closer. "Why not?" She met his gaze again. "Because you're my boss." Logan raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "And?" Naomi's throat went dry. "And it's wrong." His expression didn't change. "Wrong for who? For others or for you?" She didn't respond because she didn't have an answer. And Logan knew it. He took another step, closing the space between them. Give me one real reason why this shouldn't happen. Naomi inhaled sharply. Because it will go wrong. Logan tilted his head slightly, his voice dropping to something almost dangerous. And what if it goes right? She held her breath. Because for the first time, she considered that possibility. And that was terrifying. The silence between them pulsed with something unspoken. Naomi could feel the heat radiating from him. The intensity of his gaze. It was as if he was waiting for her to give in. And maybe, just maybe, she wanted to. But before she could do anything, Logan's phone rang. The sharp sound shattered the moment. He glanced at the screen, exhaled, then sighed. I need to take this. Naomi nodded quickly, seizing the chance to escape. She needed air. For the next few days, Naomi avoided Logan as much as she could. Not because she was angry, but because she knew that if she stayed too close, she wouldn't be able to resist. And right now, she wasn't ready to deal with that. But Logan didn't seem willing to let it go. By Tuesday afternoon, her phone buzzed again. Dinner tonight. No excuses. Naomi stared at the message. She knew that if she said yes, there would be no turning back. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. Before she could reply, another message arrived. Just dinner. I promise. Naomi let out a slow breath, and before she could change her mind, she typed her response. Okay. Dinner was surprisingly easy. They talked about work, funny office stories, normal things. And for a moment, Naomi let herself forget just how much Logan Calloway made her heart race. For one brief moment, Naomi let herself forget. Forget how complicated this was. Forget that Logan Calloway was her boss. Forget that everything about this was a bad idea. But as they were leaving the restaurant, the inevitable happened. Logan reached for her wrist just before she could step into the taxi. She turned to face him, surprised. Naomi, he said, his voice lower, deeper. Her heartbeat pounded in her ears. And then, before she could think, before she could rationalize, Logan leaned in and kissed her. The kiss wasn't planned. It wasn't logical. It was inevitable. There was heat, tension, but there was also something else. Something Naomi didn't want to admit. When they pulled apart, Logan studied her for a long moment. Then, a slow, knowing smile tugged at his lips. Is this still a mistake to you? Naomi's breath caught. She didn't know how to answer, because at that moment, the only thing in her mind was how much she wanted to kiss him again. And that was the most dangerous thing of all. Naomi couldn't stop thinking about that kiss. It was reckless. It was wrong. And yet, she couldn't bring herself to regret it. From the moment she had met Logan Calloway, her life had spun out of control. And now there was no more pretending, no more denying that something was happening between them. The problem was, what was she supposed to do about it? The next morning, Naomi woke up feeling more exhausted than when she had gone to bed. She had spent the entire night tangled in thoughts. Memories of the kiss, the way his hands had felt against her skin, the way her heart had raced in a way she couldn't explain, and the crushing uncertainty of what it all meant. She needed to be rational. She worked for Logan. He was her boss. This could complicate everything. But even as she repeated those arguments in her head, she knew it was already too late. Because the truth was simple. She wanted more. And that was a problem. At the office, things felt different, not in an obvious way. But Naomi felt Logan's eyes on her, every time he walked past her desk, every time their gazes met across the conference room. He didn't mention the kiss. But he also didn't avoid her. It was as if he was waiting for her to make a decision. And the longer she hesitated, the more she realized she needed to decide. Soon. On Friday, just as she was packing up her things at the end of the day, her phone buzzed. A message from Logan. Penthouse, 8 p.m. Her pulse raced. Naomi knew if she went, there would be no more uncertainty, no more pretending, no more running. She took a deep breath and then she made her decision. She went. When Naomi arrived at the penthouse, Logan was already there. He was leaning against the railing, looking out over the city. The golden glow of the skyline reflected off the glass walls. It was quiet, but the tension in the air was suffocating. At the sound of her approaching footsteps, Logan turned. I thought you wouldn't come, he said. Naomi gave a small, knowing smile. I thought about not coming. He raised an eyebrow. So why did you? She hesitated. Then she took a deep breath and told the truth. Because I don't want to run from this anymore. Logan held her gaze, and then, without another word, he stepped closer and kissed her again. This time there were no doubts, no excuses. It was real, and Naomi didn't want to fight it anymore. But when they finally pulled apart, one question lingered in the air. What now? In the days that followed, Naomi and Logan continued seeing each other outside of work. But inside the office, nothing changed. They remained professional. They kept their distance. But those who knew them well, they were starting to notice. And Naomi knew. It was only a matter of time before someone started asking questions. On Monday morning, Logan called her into his office. She stepped inside, closed the door, and crossed her arms. "Is this about work?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. "Or about us?" Logan smirked. This time, he leaned back in his chair. "About us." Naomi's stomach twisted. She swallowed hard. "What is it?" Logan's expression turned serious. "This can't stay a secret forever." Her heart stopped. "You want to make this public?" Logan shrugged. "I don't want to hide." His voice was calm, steady. "I don't need to." Naomi's mind raced. Her instinct was to panic, to think of all the ways this could go wrong. But deep down, she knew this day would come, because hiding had never really been an option. The real question was she ready for the consequences? Hiding what was happening between her and Logan scared Naomi more than she wanted to admit. Lately, everything between them had been easy, or at least as easy as a relationship with Logan Calloway could be. Outside of work, they saw each other nearly every night. They talked about everything, they laughed, and to her own surprise, Naomi was starting to enjoy it more than she should. But inside the office, everything was still the same, or at least it had been. Until now. The next morning, Naomi arrived at work feeling a strange tension in the air. People were looking at her differently. Some whispered in hushed voices, others just stared. A heavy feeling settled in her stomach, and then she saw why. On a nearby computer screen, a news article was pulled up. CEO of Calloway Industries spotted having an intimate dinner with an employee. Naomi's breath hitched. Her name wasn't in the article, but the photo was of her and Logan leaving the restaurant last week. Her face went hot. Without another thought, she grabbed her phone. A message from Logan was already waiting. "My office, now." When Naomi walked into his office, she shut the door and crossed her arms. So this went public sooner than expected. Logan was sitting on the edge of his desk, holding his phone. He didn't look surprised at all. "Someone saw us at the restaurant." Naomi let out a slow breath. "And now?" Logan shrugged. "Now we move forward." She raised an eyebrow. "That's it? You don't care?" He looked her straight in the eyes. "Do you care?" Naomi opened her mouth, then hesitated. Because the truth was, she didn't know the answer. In the days that followed, the gossip spread like wildfire. At the office, everyone had an opinion. Some whispered that Naomi was using Logan to climb the corporate ladder. Others speculated that she was just another distraction to him. And with every new rumor, Naomi felt more and more suffocated. But Logan? Logan seemed completely unfazed. He didn't let it shake him, didn't let it bother him, and in a way, that infuriated her. Because for him, this was simple. But for her, this was her career, her life, and now it was being treated like a scandal. By Friday, after an especially brutal day, Naomi was gathering her things to leave when Logan appeared beside her desk. "Let's go," he said. She frowned. "Where?" "A place where no one will bother us." Naomi hesitated for a second, but then she realized she needed this. So, she grabbed her bag and followed him. They went to a quiet restaurant, far from prying eyes, and for the first time in days, Naomi felt like she could breathe. Logan noticed. "Tough day?" She let out a humorless laugh. "One of the worst." Logan held her gaze for a moment. "I can fix this." Naomi shook her head. "No. If I can't handle this on my own, then I'm not strong enough to be here." Logan gave a small smile. "That's one of the things I like most about you." Her heart skipped a beat. But before she could respond, he reached across the table and took her hand. "We'll get through this." And in that moment, Naomi wanted to believe him, because despite everything, she didn't want to give up. Not on this. Not on him. Naomi never imagined her life would take this turn. When she first started working at Calloway Industries, all she wanted was stability. Now, her life was splashed across gossip websites. There were whispers in the office, curious stares, judgments she never asked for. But there was also Logan, and no matter how chaotic everything around her felt, when she was with him, it all made sense. On Monday morning, Naomi walked into the office with her head held high. She was done hiding, done letting people define her story. And to her surprise, as the day went on, the whispers started to fade, because rumors only had power if you let them. And Naomi Callahan? She wasn't going to let anyone decide her future, except herself. Scandals faded quickly, and it seemed people were ready to move on to the next one. But for Naomi, the real test was still ahead. Because lately, there was something different about Logan. Something in the way he looked at her. Something in the brief pauses before he spoke. As if he was waiting for the right moment. And deep down, Naomi felt that moment coming. On Friday night, Logan invited her to a special dinner. But this time, something about the atmosphere felt different. The restaurant was private, the table decorated with candles and flowers. And when Logan reached across and took her hand, Naomi knew something big was about to happen. He looked into her eyes, took a deep breath, and then, "Naomi, I've never been good at expressing emotions." She gave a small smile. "I noticed." Logan chuckled before shaking his head slightly. "But you changed that." Naomi's heart pounded. Logan let out a sigh before continuing. "I thought my life was complete, that I had everything I needed. But then you came along." His voice dropped to something softer. "And for the first time, I realized I was missing something." Naomi felt her eyes sting with tears. And then, Logan smiled slightly, before kneeling in front of her. Naomi's eyes widened, her breath caught in her throat. Logan reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. When he opened it, the ring inside gleamed under the soft light. "I never imagined I'd find someone like you," Logan murmured. His grip on her hand was firm. "Someone who challenges me, who makes me laugh, who makes me want to be a better man." A tear slid down Naomi's cheek. "You taught me that life isn't just about success." Logan's voice was steady. "It's about who we share it with." He took a deep breath, his eyes locked on hers. "So Naomi Callahan," his lips curled into the smallest smile, "will you be my wife?" Naomi's heart felt like it would burst. She couldn't stop smiling, even as the tears fell, and then she spoke the words that would change her life forever. "Yes." For the first time in a long while, Logan Calloway smiled openly. He slid the ring onto her finger, then stood and pulled her into a kiss full of promises. In that moment, nothing else mattered. Nothing except the fact that they had chosen each other. Months later, the big day finally arrived. Naomi had never felt so nervous, but she had also never felt so happy. She stood in front of the mirror, her white dress flowing around her. Her eyes sparkled with emotion. And when the chapel doors opened, she saw him. Logan stood at the altar, waiting. He looked impeccable in his black suit, but his eyes, they held the same intensity as always. Only now, there was something deeper. Something only she had the privilege of knowing. As Naomi walked down the aisle, everything around her faded away. It was just her and him. And when she stopped in front of him, she knew she was exactly where she was meant to be. The judge began the ceremony, but Naomi barely heard the words. All she could feel was Logan's presence, the way he held her hands so firmly, as if he would never let go. And then, it was time for the vows. Logan looked at her and smiled. "Naomi, I never imagined that someone like you would walk into my life." His voice softened and turned everything upside down in the most perfect way. She let out a soft laugh, feeling tears well up. "I've always been a man who needed certainty." Logan took a deep breath. "But you taught me that sometimes the best things in life are the ones we don't plan." His fingers tightened around hers. "I promise to love you, to support you, and to remind you every single day how much you've made my life better." Naomi swallowed against the lump in her throat. And then, it was her turn. She took a deep breath and smiled. "Logan, when I met you, I had no idea how much you would turn my world upside down." Logan chuckled softly. Naomi smiled. "But now," her voice wavered slightly, "I can't imagine my life without you." She took another deep breath, because what came next was the easiest promise she had ever made. Naomi took a deep breath and smiled through her happy tears. "I promise to love you even when you're stubborn." Logan chuckled softly, his grip on her hands tightening. "Luke, I promise to laugh at your bad jokes." That earned a quiet laugh from their guests. "I promise to stand by your side through every victory." Her voice grew steadier, and every challenge. Naomi looked into Logan's deep blue eyes, eyes that held every unspoken promise between them. And most of all, she took a breath, her heart swelling with certainty. "I promise to be yours, today and always." Logan swallowed hard. For once, he had no words, only emotion, raw, unfiltered. The judge's voice rang through the chapel. "I now pronounce you husband and wife." And Logan Calloway didn't wait a second longer. He pulled Naomi into a deep, passionate kiss, a kiss full of promises, a kiss full of forever. The crowd erupted into applause. Some guests cheered, others wiped away tears. But Naomi, all she could feel was Logan. All she could hear was the pounding of her own heart, because in this moment, nothing else mattered. This wasn't the end of their journey. This was only the first page of a new story, a story they would write together, forever. What did you think of Naomi and Logan's story? Leave your thoughts in the comments. On a scale from 0 to 10, how would you rate their journey? Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. And don't forget, click here to watch more heartwarming, emotional stories.